Thank you, Wella, and thank you to everybody at the Palestine Coalition for inviting me to speak today. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy to have heard from the panelists before us, and I'm very much looking forward to continuing in this sort of advocacy. So thank you. My name is Beisan Zubi, and I'm a proud Palestinian Canadian. My parents emigrated to Canada in 1978 from Nazareth, a majority Palestinian city in Israel, to Toronto. My mother is a professor and my father is an artist. Their Palestinian identities form their entire life's work, and you can see it all over their house, in my childhood home, everywhere we go. They raised me and my older brother within our culture, loving our culture, our food, the music, our history. And as much as they could, they would take us back home on, summer-long trips. That I actually, as a child, used to complain that we never went to Disneyland. We always would go, to what I felt like was a war zone in the context of my quiet Ottawa life, going back there every summer. I was raised and I started my career here in Ottawa, in the Ottawa bubble, as they call it. And even though, we struggled financially when I was young, and we were establishing ourselves as a young family of immigrants, I still had a very privileged upbringing, and I was bussed into white, wealthy public schools, and very much had educational privilege that continued all the way, to my graduate degree, where I wrote maybe the least useful master's thesis on Canadian political satire. So all of that is to say that while I'm extremely Palestinian, my life has been very much embedded within Canadian culture and within Canadian politics and the Canadian way of understanding things. I worked on Parliament Hill in my 20s. I've been active in Canadian politics for over a decade, and I recently became the NDP candidate in Kitchener Centre for the next federal election. While, my home is Palestinian and my, Canadian culture and political work is where I've lived, I've often felt very much pulled between the two, and very much, a contradiction between the two. I have faced open, unabashed Canadian racism for being Palestinian my entire life. My entire life. I learned the likelihood of a negative reaction to my ethnicity at a very young age. And I learned that it was easier to just lie about it than actually being honest about, or being vague even, saying Middle Eastern, or, you know what I mean? My parents are from Toronto, and I would never give that answer. But as I grew into claiming my Palestinian identity more in my 20s, I was also navigating professional and political settings, and a range of reactions from discomfort to dismissal, to insult, to mockery. These experiences were even more hurtful and traumatic when they occurred in my personal and my private life. I am fed up, and it's time to call it out for what it is. It's anti-Palestinian racism. And that's it. That's what it is. It's racism against Palestinian people. Like all racisms, anti-Palestinian racism is built up to normalize systems of oppression by dehumanizing, trivializing, and criminalizing its victims and silencing its supporters. Anti-Palestinian racism did not exist until the occupation of Palestinian lands and resources needed to be justified. And like all racisms, it serves as a better lens to understand the needs of the system that created it, rather than any objective truth about the people that it harms. I grew up in Canada, haunted by the words terrorist, a concept that I learned about from popular culture and cable TV news. The terrorist was always wearing a keffiyeh, the centuries-old Palestinian scarf design representing fishermen's nets and olive trees, which was appropriated from our culture to become the top Google query for what scarf do terrorists wear. Literally, if you Google what scarf do terrorists wear on Google, it says, do you mean the keffiyeh? That's the response that you get on Google. All Palestinian men are immediately terrorists under this racism. And we see that in the news reports that our deaths are reported on as women, children, and militants, as though those are the only shapes that Palestinians can come in. Palestinian men are sensitive, loving fathers, sons, brothers, and men whose entire humanity is stolen from them in almost every single news report you will ever see. Palestinian women are not spared their humanity for Western consumption either. The timeless, never-ending filler reel of a sobbing mother in front of her destroyed home, that is become a meme almost of Palestinians, the agony, the wailing, the despair. A 13-year-old girl is called terrorist by grown, serious men. A much younger one with perfect English just a couple months ago asking how she's supposed to fix this in front of her bombed out home. It's the continued dehumanization of Palestinians, and it serves to create a narrative that our situation is natural and that our suffering is inevitable. Neither of these things are true. Anti-Palestinian racism is also our erasure. I've been regularly advised to hide or conceal my Palestinianness, to be not seen as controversial or offensive. One time when I was sitting in the front row of famous comedians' set as a headlining set at Just for Laughs, Montreal, opening night, I was so excited. I had front row tickets, you know, and called on me. And the act was, you know, what's your background? And I said, Palestinian. And he goes, anyone else? You know, I've been told to my face that Palestinians don't exist and that I'm actually an Israeli Arab several times. Most recently, last month. I'm not even joking. Last month. For a long time, I contributed to anti-Palestinian racism myself by internalizing the idea that it was shameful to be Palestinian because of the hateful responses that I received when I did share my ethnicity. There have been abusive experiences. When I was 15, a boy from another high school screamed at me on a crowded Ottawa city bus that I was a terrorist and a sand N-word, and he started laughing as I just stared in shock. I could not say anything. Nobody said anything. Another time, at a table full of friends, one launched into an impression of what they thought it would be like if my parents ever found out I was in a relationship with a white man. Through a heavy accent, I heard about honor killings. There was a scenario in which my parents were setting up bombs outside this fictitious person's house. And in both cases, I said nothing. There was nothing I could say. How do you respond to that? What are you going to educate people on in this situation? Another dark and insidious part of anti-Palestinian racism are the accusations of anti-Semitism or hate for asserting Palestinian humanity. Neither Palestinians nor Israelis will ever be free until we're free, we're both free, and our collective liberation and safety. That is the only way to peace. Palestinian rights and dignity do not come at the expense of any other group's rights or dignity. They just don't. No oppressed group's liberation comes at the cost of the dignity or security of anyone, as none of us are free until we're all liberated from injustice. To treat the struggle for Palestinian human rights as fundamentally different than everyone else's struggle for human rights is anti-Palestinian racism. Because of the conflation of my people's struggle and my people's humanity and liberation with another people's unacceptable trauma and abuse. Another terrible element of anti-Palestinian racism is that upon telling people that I'm Palestinian, sometimes they think I want to hear anti-Semitic things. At times in my life, I have felt like a lightning rod for hate directed at Jewish people, spanning the gamut of, wildly anti-Semitic conspiracy theories to just random complaints about a Jewish coworker or an ex shared with me only because they think I'll appreciate it because I'm Palestinian. I have never wavered in my support and my belief of Jewish people when they speak about the anti-Semitism that they face here in Canada, because I see it all too clearly with my own two eyes when I share that I'm Palestinian. When they're also being racist against me, that is that shared racism, that is shared white supremacy. Palestinians have been told what we are for decades, but yet none of us are ever allowed to speak for ourselves. Palestinian human rights supporters have been trying to educate the world on the difference between the Israeli state and Jewish people as a faith for a very, very long time. But our silencing has allowed both anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinian racism to flourish. I work as a social responsibility consultant, and I'm often asked how to create ethical purchasing or partnership strategies that fit within your mission and your values. That could be sustainability, gender or economic equality, accessibility, human rights. But we know that corporations are actually quite sensitive to organizational pressure against them. That can look a lot of different ways. These strategies are applied daily in myriad contexts, and I show my clients how to apply these in practice. For example, if they wanted to condemn human rights abuses, I could provide them with a list of Canadian organizations supporting the Saudi government's siege on Yemenis, resulting in 20,000 deaths and a massive humanitarian crisis, which includes the Canadian government, by the way, in $2 billion of weapons sold to Saudi forces in the last year alone. I could tell them about that. I could provide them with multiple sustainable purchasing guides, ethical purchasing guides. But both my provincial and my federal governments have passed motions not allowing me to do that if they ever ask me how to apply economic, cultural, or diplomatic pressure on Israel to protect Palestinian human rights. I can't do that. These allegations turn me into a racist, barbaric Palestinian stereotype and nothing more. Nothing more. Every time an anti-BDS law or an anti-free speech law has been challenged in the US courts, for example, they have been struck down as unconstitutional. I believe Canadian versions would also not pass any similar legal rights-based challenge. We've seen as Palestinian Canadians, our governments legislate anti-Palestinian hate, erase us and invisibilize us by calling us only Arabs, continue to ascribe hateful intent to us for resisting a situation that no Palestinian asked to be put in. And we even see them, supporting and condoning vicious attacks against Palestinians, both here and abroad. One of the moments that I kind of was struggling very hard with was in last May, as the only, Palestinian nominated in Canada, and watching the way our government acted in that situation. All the elected officials from the provincial and federal levels of government, and nobody saying anything and nobody speaking out at what I was seeing and what I was hearing. It changed something in me. It really did. When I decided to run federally, I knew I would have to deal with all Canadian racisms. I would have to do that work on all of them, but I knew that I had to face my own anti-Palestinian racism as well. The first time I was ever referred to as openly Palestinian was by a young woman who wanted to volunteer on my campaign 2.5 months ago. Before that, in my life, I had never been openly Palestinian. It sounded funny the first time I heard it, like from the 1950s, just an anachronism of just a Gen Z mouth saying, oh, you're openly Palestinian, and with shock. The next time I heard it, it wasn't funny. It was sad. It hurt my feelings. It made me feel terrible. I felt guilt. I felt sadness. And I felt angry that it had taken me 35 years to have heard that. To discover that the next generation of Palestinian Canadians are growing up the same way that I did, internalizing that hatred, internalizing those words is unacceptable to me. It's only been 3 months since my nomination, but I find myself irrevocably, openly Palestinian. I am determined to defend our rights, our humanity, keep building on this wave of anti-racist solidarity for peace and justice for Palestinians and Israelis. No Palestinian woman has ever been elected to the Canadian House of Commons. One Palestinian man was elected by the name of Pierre de Benet. He was elected before I was born and then served as a senator for about 20 years as well. His family fled the Nakba from Haifa, where my grandmother was born, and settled in Montreal in 1947. He was very openly Palestinian, I will say, though, and he became a Liberal cabinet minister in 1978, the same year that my parents came to Canada. My parents have experienced a lot of things that I haven't and that I don't comprehend. And actually, one of them is what a Trudeau government that values Palestinians could look like. The power of representation, of being openly Palestinian, feels good, but I don't want to be the only Palestinian running. I want more of us to be unafraid, to show our pride and our strength and not back down from our role in the collective struggle across the world against oppression and hate and towards dignity, respect, justice, and peace for us all. Thank you.